I think that you would be really hard-pressed to find anybody who loved reading more than this girl. She was tall, but her heart was sad because it had been a long time since she'd seen her uncle who had travelled far across the sea. But she had been into the library and she had picked up a brand new book. It filled the air with the smell of ink in the pages. She loved to hold these books, and she loved the fact that she had taught herself to read. Now she was standing on a stony path and waiting for the tram to take her back to her house. She'd been to the library. The library hadn't been open that long, and other people would say, "What are you doing trying to read? You're just a girl." But she didn't listen. And now she held a beautiful book inside of her hand, and she loved the smell, and she nearly missed the tram as it went past. It was a cold day, but it was going from the afternoon into dusk and heading towards the evening. But she took the book and slammed it shut in her hands, and it seemed as if there was even more of the smell of the book in the air, and she placed it underneath her arm, and she loved books. There wasn't enough light on the tram as it rattled and careered along on its tracks, but when it took her back to her house, she smiled because she could see that there was the pond that was outside of her house. But here, far away from the middle of the town, the paths weren't made of stone. They were muddy and they were dirty. And as she stood there just to take a little look at the pond, she heard a voice that made her heart skip a beat. It was her uncle's voice. He had his sailor's hat upon his head, and he had travelled far across the sea. He looked at her and said, You're a real sight for sore eyes. I haven't seen you for such a long time, and I've decided that I'm not going to sail across." Oh, she didn't wait to hear the rest of what he was going to say. She hugged him in her arms. She nearly dropped the book, but she didn't want that to happen to its bright and shining pages. She held it under her arms. "Oh, I'm so pleased to see you. I'm really pleased to see—" "Oh, you don't need to shout and scream like that," said her uncle. And he reached behind his back, and here he brought out a boat that he had made for her. He'd cut it and carved it himself. It was fine and strong and beautifully made. And as the dusk was turning to evening, the two of them placed the boat on the small pond, and with what breeze there was, they watched it sail across the water to the other side. They could quite easily reach for it. They could pull it up by its sail. They could take it and use it. And, well, it was a boat that she loved very much. Now, her uncle had many stories to tell about where he'd been and what he'd done. And she loved that boat, and she would play with it. Now, her little baby brother loved to play with it too, and they would play on the pond by the light of the sun in the middle of winter and at the very beginning of spring. But when their family decided that they had enough money, just enough money, to go on a holiday by the side of the sea, she decided that she would take the boat with her. She had saved up enough money to make a small toy for her baby brother, because they couldn't afford to go to a shop to buy a toy. She knew that she would have to make one for him. It was a bag, and inside of the bag there were dice that they could play with, dice that he could stack up, and he was very grateful to his bigger sister for making it for him. Often he just used to like it to hold in his hands and shake and rattle it. But they went to the side of the sea and they loved it. She'd never seen the sea before. It filled the air with a salty taste on her tongue. And they took the boat that her uncle had made for her. A good, strong, wooden boat. And they placed it and they played with it in the rock pools, and would go from one side of the rock pools to the other. And they would put the small bag that she had made for her brother with the dice inside, they put it on side and pretend that it was passengers on an ocean-going liner. They pretended that it was cargo that was being brought from the far East Indies. But then they decided that they would play with the boat in the waves, and the waves were going backwards and forwards, crashing this way and that, but they always stayed in the shallow part of the sea and didn't go too far out, and they'd be able to pick the boat up. But when she wasn't looking, her baby brother took the bag with the dice inside and placed it inside of the boat, and I don't know what it was that distracted them. Perhaps it was when they were looking at the seagulls that were circling over their heads. But this precious toy, with the other toy inside of it, their precious toys, the only toys that they had, started to go further and further out to sea. The wind blew it. It was almost as if the sea wanted to take it back. Her mother and her father shouted to them, "Stop! You can't go any further. You can't go and reach it." As well as learning to read, she wished she'd learned how to swim. And they watched the boat as it sailed far out to sea. Years later, she would still have that book, which had once been so shiny and new, but she'd read it so much that it was an old book, and she wondered what had happened to her old toy, the toy that had been made for her by her uncle. And perhaps it would have made her laugh to think that that boat sailed through all of the ages and the years and across the 7 seas and landed on a shore many continents away. People were puzzled when they found it. They looked and saw this boat with another small toy inside of it that looked as if it had hardly been used. They could not work out where this boat had come from. They couldn't work out how it had been made. All they knew was that it was very old. It was taken and placed inside of a museum. And all of the children who would come and look at that boat with a small bag inside, with the small dice inside of that, they would look at it and they would be asked to work out just how the boat had got there. And they would be asked to write a story about who or where or what or why or when it had got to that place. As a woman, I think that it would have made her laugh to think that's something that she'd been given when she was a tall girl by the side of a pond by her uncle. She'd have laughed out loud to think that so many people had looked at something that had once been hers, that had once been so new, but now was old and caused so many tongues to wag, so many brains to think about how the story of the boat could be written down. And all of the stories were collected and placed inside of a book that was filled with imagination, stories that answered who and where and what and why and when.